मेरा नाम सतवंत कौर, मेरा पिंड का नाम है बिलगा। प्रकाश सिंह मेरे मामा जी सीगे। छोटी हुंदी तो मेरे बाप गुजर गया सी ते असीं फिर अपने नाना जी दे कोल आके रहे हैं, बस उत्थे पले हैं। अज तक असीं उन्हां दे कोल हैं। मामा जी हुणी जापानी लै गए सी, जापानी रेलवे लाइन बनाउंदे सी ते इत्थों बहुत सारे लै गए सी कुली काम करने वाले, ऑल इंडियन। तनख्वाह ज़्यादा दिंदे सी ते वो बेचारे चले गए सी नाल, पर उत्थे उन्हां दी बुरी हालत हुंदी सी। खाना भी कोई अच्छा नहीं मिलिया ते बस उत्थों दा वायुमंडल भी चंगा नहीं सी। मच्छर, जंगल ही जंगल। उत्थों की हालत बहुत मंदी सी। कोई कर्मां वाला उत्थों मुड़िया। इन्नी दुनिया गई पर मुड़े थोड़े, उत्थे रह गए। खाना दिंदे सी, खाना उन्हां दा सी, चौल होर विच भाजी भूजी हो कुछ, वो इहो जिहियां चीज़ां खांदे नहीं सी। ਉਹ ਰੋਟੀ ਖਾਣੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਅੱਧਾ ਹੀ ਭੁੱਖੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀ। ਅਤੇ ਜਿੱਦਣ ਆਏ ਸੀ ਕਾਫੀ ਉਹ ਕਮਜ਼ੋਰ ਹੋਏ ਹੋਏ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਹਾਲਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਖਰਾਬ ਸੀ, ਖੁਰਕ ਪਈ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ, ਪਿੰਡ ਸਿਰ ਜੂਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਭਰਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ। ਹਾਂ, ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੁਣੀ ਇਪੋ ਤੋਂ ਰੇਲ ਚੜ੍ਹੇ ਆ, ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੁਲੀ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਤਾਈਲੈਂਡ ਗਏ ਆ। ਉੱਥੇ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਵੀ ਰਹਿ ਕੋਈ ਸੌਣ ਬਹਿਣ ਵਾਲੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਚੰਗੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ, ਅਤੇ ਪਾਣੀ ਤਾਂ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ, ਖਾਣਾ ਵੀ ਚੰਗਾ ਨਹੀਂ। ਉਹੀ ਉਹ ਪਾਣੀ ਪੀਂਦੇ ਸੀ, ਨਹਾਉਂਦੇ ਸੀ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਤੇ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਿਮਾਰ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਸੀ ਜਾਂਦੇ। ਜਾਣੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਦਵਾਈਆਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਸੀ, ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਬਚਾਅ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਅਤੇ ਗਰੀਬਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਇੰਨੀਆਂ ਦਵਾਈਆਂ ਕਿੱਥੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਬੁਰਾ ਹਾਲ ਹੋਇਆ। ਅਤੇ ਇਹ ਬੌਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਖੜ੍ਹੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ, ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਬਿਮਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ। ਅਤੇ ਬੰਬ ਡਿੱਗਿਆ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹ ਫੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਉਹਦੀ ਇੱਕ ਚਿੱਪਰ ਉੱਡ ਕੇ ਐਡੀ ਦੂਰ ਆ ਕੇ ਇਹਦੇ ਵੱਜੀ, ਲੱਤ 'ਤੇ ਵੱਜੀ ਸੀ। ਜੀਨ ਦੀ ਪਤਲੂਨ ਨੇ ਮੋਟੀ ਉਹਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵੱਜੀ ਹੈ। ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਉਹਨੇ ਬੜਾ ਅਸਰ ਕੀਤਾ, ਦੁਖਦੀ ਰਹੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਲੱਤ, ਬਹੁਤ ਚਿਰ ਦੁਖਦੀ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਉਹਦੀ ਜ਼ਹਿਰ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ, ਉਹ ਜ਼ਹਿਰ ਬੰਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜ਼ਹਿਰ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਹਾਂ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੰਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪਰਦੇ ਹਿੱਲ ਗਏ ਅਤੇ ਸੁਣਨੋਂ ਔਖਾ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ, ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੁਣਦਾ ਸੀ। ਉੱਥੇ ਜੰਗਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਵੀ ਲੁਕਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ, ਅਤੇ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ ਸਿੰਘ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਚੋਰੀ ਚੋਰੀ ਖਾਣਾ ਪਹੁੰਚਦਾ ਕਰਦਾ ਸੀ। ਜੇ ਜਾਪਾਨੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਅਤੇ ਦੋਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੰਦੇ, ਪਰ ਨਹੀਂ, ਇਹ ਦਿੰਦਾ। ਹਾਂ, ਜਦੋਂ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਇਆ, ਜਦੋਂ ਉਹ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਇਆ ਉੱਥੋਂ, ਉਹਨੇ ਆ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਕੁਛ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਦਦ ਨਾ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਮੁੜ ਕੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਣਾ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਫਿਰ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਡਲ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਸਰਟੀਫਿਕੇਟ ਦਿੱਤਾ।
Because initially it was almost like a contract. They were supposed to go there for 3 months, and then they had a choice whether they wanted to come back or stay. Well, that was the choice that was on paper, but in reality they didn't have a choice. They were required to stay, and my father stayed there longer. It seems he was sent twice to the Death Railroad. He first went there in 1942, and then he came back in 1943. And then he said that in May of 1943 he was sent again, and he stayed there almost a year because he came back in May of 1944. They were first sent by the train to Ban Pong, where they had to stay overnight, and they were evaluated for their medical fitness, to make sure that they didn't have malaria or cholera, etc. And he talked about how it was just, one open camp, and they were pretty much sleeping on gunny sacks. He said if you had a gunny sack, you would use that and sleep on it. So they stayed overnight there, got evaluated. Then they were put on a train to Kanchanburi, and then they stayed there a few more days, I guess, basically to get orientation, and then they were moved to Venpo. He stayed the longest in Venpo, almost 6 months, although he was then also required to go up north, and that, I think, closer to the Burmese border. My father talked about how his group, the medical group, was set up. So it was essentially a 5-person team. There was one Japanese doctor and 4 medical personnel, or medical orderlies as they were called then. So there was my dad, there was one Tamil gentleman, one Chinese gentleman, and one Malay gentleman. So they were all from Malaysia, and quite a representation of all the communities in Malaysia. And my father talked about how, in contrast to the laborers and also the prisoners of war, the medical corps was actually treated relatively well, right? They were still prisoners in the sense that they didn't have free will, but they were treated relatively well. So my father used to talk about how they were provided a cook. Their unit itself had a cook who would cook for them, go into the village and buy food, and they would actually keep a tally of how much it costs. And at the end of the month, they had to pay for that because they were actually provided a salary. One of the anecdotes that I have from my father about how the medical corps was treated better is that, they were all given an armband with a red cross on it. And they had, in Japanese, they had written the names, Dr. So-and-so. I guess they wrote doctor for all of them. And when they would move about the camp and even a little bit outside the camp, they did get better treatment and even respect. Dad talked about how some of the guards, and he mentioned that the Japanese used Koreans as the guards around a lot of the camp. And he said that the soldiers, upon seeing the Red Cross, would salute them and kind of let them through. So this was certainly much better treatment compared to the European and Australian prisoners of war especially. So he talked about how being part of the medical corps was certainly helpful, and in turn they made a big difference in terms of helping people survive. It was up to them, the medical corps, to say whether someone was well enough to be sent, and they would very often make the recommendation that these people cannot be sent. And surprisingly, they said that at least in my father's group, the Japanese doctor who was in charge of the group, he would pretty much support them or not contradict them. So if it was their recommendation that somebody not be sent, he wouldn't send them. My father also spoke about how the actual track that they were laying was often about 3 to 6, sometimes even 10 miles from the camp. And every day the laborers and the prisoners had to walk through the jungle to reach that camp. And very often it used to be raining, and the prisoners were already weak, and the laborers. And so they would actually get pneumonia, get a fever, and many of them would die along the way as well. And that is what my father and his medical corps group were trying to prevent. That is to weed out those who couldn't make the 3-mile or the 6-mile track, and try to get them to stay at the camp. And there was actually a hospital at their camp as well. So those who were really bad were sent to the camp. Most of the people from Malaysia knew that if they go up further north to the Burmese border, to the stations or the camps that were further north, there was less of a chance of survival. So they tried to avoid doing that, and sometimes they would refuse. So I did ask my dad that, could you actually refuse? And he says that, yes, they would ask them, but then there were consequences. So he talked about a story where there was one time when they really did not want to go, and so they refused. And so what happened is that they were then handed over to the military police, the MPs, to deal with, because the rest of the camp was, including the Japanese soldiers, apparently there was a whole garrison there, and the entire garrison with the rest of the camp was moving up north. So they were taking the train up north, and all of these people who had refused or who was some kind of a problem were handed over to the military police. Well, fortunately, the MP, the chief military police officer, was friends with my dad and the medical group, because what had happened was that he was quite ill. Apparently, he had some lingering TB effects, and he had needed certain medication, calcium injections, I think. And he would come to my dad's group, and my dad would actually give him those injections. So they had become friends. And that Japanese MP had advised them that, you refuse to go, and then you'll be handed over to my group, and then I'll help you resettle in a camp near here so that you don't have to go up north. So that's exactly what happened. They were handed over, and this MP was kind enough to find another place for them so that they were able to avoid conditions that were much worse than where they were. My dad did get sick with malaria when he was there. He talked about that as well, but not cholera. Apparently, cholera and dysentery were the things to avoid, because that is certainly what would get you killed through dehydration and weakness, etc. So he talked about how they had their own medicines, and when they knew that somebody had cholera or there was an outbreak of cholera, the medical corps people they were given the medicines and they would take it beforehand. And he also talked about how the Japanese would give them opium as part of this. He said, but they stopped taking that very quickly, because once they were given that, then the second day and third day, they would be extremely weak if they didn't get it again. So that was interesting that there was the use of opium over there. By the time the war ended, my father came back to Parit. He was already back in Malaysia working in Parit, and he was actually not aware that he was recommended for a medal and a letter of commendation from the British. So he actually did get the King George VI Defense Medal, which is this medal here. It is given for bravery and service to civilians. So he got this and a letter of commendation, which is in our home now. It was for his service during the time that he spent on the death railroad. And his commandant back in the hospital, sort of recognized the role that Dad and some of his fellow Malaysians had played in helping the laborers and the prisoners of war survive that time. They understood that medical care was critical, and these men had shown bravery and did what was what could be done to take care of the prisoners and the laborers. So and in all the civilians essentially. So he was given this, and very happy to know that his time there was recognized. And so that is a picture of my dad, and those are the experiences that he had on the death railroad.